Zachy Hassan is your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
Dr. David Banner, physician, scientist, searching for a way to tap into the hidden strengths that all humans have. Then an accidental overdose of gamma radiation alters his body chemistry. And now when David Banner grows angry or outraged, a startling metamorphosis occurs.
Hi everybody, welcome back to Nostalgia Theater. This is Zachy Hassan, and you heard the music. What we're talking about this week is The Incredible Hulk, the TV version of The Incredible Hulk, which aired on CBS for 5 seasons from 1978 to 1982 for a total of 82 weekly installments. Each week, David Banner, played by Bill Bixby, would wander the country from town to town, seeking a cure for his big green problem, played by Lou Ferrigno, while also staying one step ahead of the dogged reporter at his heel, played by Jack Colvin. It was a template that had previously been used by The Fugitive, The Invaders, Kung Fu, countless others, but it was a perfect setup for the Hulk, which began its life in the Marvel Comics series created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko in the early 60s, and marked the first serious attempt at doing a weekly superhero TV show ever. It was developed by Kenneth Johnson. The show found a receptive chord with audiences and became a substantial hit, making the Hulk Marvel's biggest crossover hit, and for a while their only crossover hit, until the late 1980s. Now, I was a big fan of this show growing up, and here to discuss the series with me is somebody who I'm pretty sure was an even bigger fan of the show growing up, and that is Glenn Greenberg. Glenn is an award-winning editor and writer whose work has appeared in such publications as Time Magazine for Kids, Scholastic News, Time Out New York, Back Issue, and Smoke. He's also worked for Marvel Comics and DC Comics and such world-famous franchises as Spider-Man, the Hulk, Silver Surfer, Thor, Iron Man, Dracula, and Star Trek, and web-based tie-in projects for the film Superman Returns and the weekly comic book series 52. Glenn has also written several works of Star Trek fiction for Simon & Schuster and the X-Files for IDW. He avidly covers all aspects of popular culture on his blog Glenn Greenberg's Grumblings, and you can find that at glenngreenbergsgrumblings.blogspot.com, and welcomes anyone and everyone to check it out. And I want to welcome Glenn to the show. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Zachy. It's a pleasure to finally be talking to you live.
Now, Glenn, you and I, we have known each other for, I'm pretty sure, more than 10 years at this point.
Yeah, I'd say so.
And yet, this is actually the very first time that we're talking, and I need to share this with the audience. Glenn, you have heard this story before online, but back in high school, I used to, I had free periods during the middle of the day. This is like my senior year, and I used to bring various comics and stuff to read in my break, and I would buy Hulk comics, and specifically, I remember there was a Hulk trade paperback called Hulk Transformations. And Glenn, I don't know if you remember that or not.
I do.
And it was a series of stories chronicling the various incarnations of the Hulk, and there were little interstitials in that trade, which were written by Glenn. And it was very helpful just as a way of setting the context of the stories. And then shortly thereafter, or right about then, there was also the Incredible Hulk magazine, which Marvel put out, which was edited by you, Glenn.
Yes.
And then I remember reading your text piece, and I remember thinking at the time, man, this guy loves the Hulk even more than I do. It's amazing, and so I went from there to now. The fact that we've become such good friends and stuff, it always remained at the back of my mind. I was like, when I have a chance to talk about the Hulk TV show, I know the one person who I want to be able to talk about it with. So this is like this whole show is really just an excuse to finally talk to Glenn Greenberg in person.
Only because Kenny Johnson wasn't available, right?
But you talked to Kenny Johnson.
That's true, I did.
So worth pointing out and we should tell our audience, it was for back issue number. Do you remember the number off the top of your head?
Oh boy. It was actually, I think it was number 70, maybe.
Okay. And it was a back issue magazine, folks. For those of you who don't know, it's a magazine published by Tomorrows, and it covers comic books primarily from like the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I think, right? That's kind of the
pretty much, yeah. Everything but like the modern day.
Okay. So everything, all the good stuff, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, in fact, I would drop off the '90s if we want to talk about good stuff.
Oh, there you go. Fair enough. So it's a perfect magazine for me because that's the era I grew up reading comics in. But they had a Hulk issue. It was all about the Hulk during the Bronze Age, I think it was. And so
Exactly.
there was an article about the Hulk TV series, which Glenn wrote, and so you got to go real in depth on the show. You talked to Ken Johnson, and so this is actually perfect because this is hopefully we'll get to draw on some of the tidbits that you got from that conversation.
Absolutely. I spoke to Kenny Johnson, and I also spoke to Gerald Ipigo, who wrote the last two TV movies.
Right, which Bill Bixby directed.
Yeah.
Well, perfect. Well, let's talk about your exposure to the show. I mean, how old were you when you saw the Incredible Hulk TV series?
Well, if I recall, the first TV movie was in like November of 1977, so I would have been around 8 at that time. So by that point, I'd already been exposed to Star Wars and, the original Star Trek, Batman for sure. And I think I was reading the Hulk comic book fairly regularly at that time. So I knew that the Hulk was a scientist named Bruce Banner, and he was constantly being pursued by General Thunderbolt Ross and Major Glenn Talbot, and Talbot was married to Banner's old flame Betty. So I got all of I knew all the particulars at that point. So when the TV show premiered, or at least that first television movie, what I do remember, the two things that I have the most vivid memories of is that for the first 45 minutes to an hour, I kept wondering when Bruce Banner was going to actually show up. There was this scientist that they kept calling David, and I'm like, okay, he must be a new character. He must be a friend of Dr. Banner's, but where's Bruce? and it wasn't until he actually turned into the Hulk that I realized, oh, they changed his first name. And that's the God's honest truth. I assumed that Dr. Elena Marks was Betty until I was set straight on that. And I do remember being pretty creeped out by the Hulk. I remember being kind of scared of him.
Sure.
Because that initial makeup was pretty intense.
Pretty grotesque a little bit.
Yeah. They toned it down early in the first season, but those are my most vivid memories. And I kept wondering when the Hulk was going to talk. So
Sure.
I went into it with some really sort of preconceived notions of what the show was going to be, and was kind of waiting to see these familiar elements. I didn't understand about adaptation and changing things from one medium to another. But what I do remember was being very moved by the story. And thinking that Bill Bixby was perfectly cast, whether it was Bruce or David, he was terrific. Yeah.
See, it's so fascinating, right? Because we are in this age now where we take for granted the idea that, well, if this was in the comics, this is what you put in the show or the movie. We live in an age where there's a whole bunch of Marvel Universe movies. We live in an age of Avengers movies. So it's almost like when we talk about the Incredible Hulk TV show and we look at how, I mean, in a lot of ways, basically they got the character's green color correct, and that's about it.
Right. Well, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, and I mean, it's something that for as terrific as the show was, they were very, and certainly from the outside looking in, they were very dismissive of the majority of the conceits from the comic book.
Absolutely. I mean, that was really a conscious decision on Kenny Johnson's part. I mean, at the time, I think that the one thing that they sort of like had as an example of what not to do was the Batman TV series.
Sure.
And you could say whatever you want about how dopey it was, how silly, how funny, comedic, and all that. But in terms of capturing the tropes and the at least the superficial aspects of the comic books, Batman did a really good job. I mean,
right.
Frank Gorshin as the Riddler was absolutely fantastic. Cesar Romero's Joker, I mean, they really that was a show that embraced a lot of the tropes of comic books, but then turned around and made fun of them.
Right.
And so and even Wonder Woman to a certain extent, could not be taken seriously. And I think that
It was a jiggle show, Wonder Woman, for the majority of the mainstream audience. It was a chance to see Linda Carter running around in very skimpy clothing.
Right. Although they did treat the character with respect, which I have to give him credit for. But I think that between Kenny Johnson, who had, who's made it clear many times over the past 40 years, he has no interest in comic books whatsoever. And you also had Bill Bixby, who was his first and only choice to play Dr. Banner. You had Bill Bixby, who, balked initially at the thought of doing a comic book show, and had to be convinced that, no, we're going to be taking this very seriously. We're not going to be, having you run around in leotards, and spouting, silly double entendres. And so you had those two elements together that the show had to be what it ultimately ended up being.
Well, and what was that? I mean, having spoken with Kenneth Johnson, what was his approach to taking the world created by Stan and Jack and making it into a CBS drama?
Well, I think first and foremost, he wanted to do, he'll never say The Fugitive, really. I mean, he'll never make that comparison to The Fugitive. I think you have to really sort of like pin him down to say it. He always says Les Miserables.
Sure. Sure.
Les Miserables crossed with, to some extent, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Right. And the whole thing about the beast within and making the show as relatable as possible. Every show, when a writer would go in to pitch the show to him, an episode, a story idea to him, he would say, what's the Hulk of this episode? So in other words, we're going to do an episode about child abuse, where the father is a rageaholic. Well, rage is that or drinking or alcoholism or drugs. That's the guest character's Hulk. That's the sort of monkey on their back that ties them in with Banner, because obviously the monkey on Banner's back is the Hulk. And so that's what he really wanted to do, is stories about people, stories of human interest, stories about people trying to overcome their dark side.
So in that sense, I mean, the approach was like, I'm curious, like in his mind, was Ken Johnson looking at the show as, well, we've got this sort of sci-fi element and let's make the most of it, but let's really try to tell these dramatic interpersonal stories?
I think you're on the right track, but I think it was more like, we've got this sci-fi element, let's try to make the least of it.
Touche.
And it's funny because Kenny Johnson is the same guy who brought, aliens and Bigfoot to the $6 Million Man.
Right.
And he I think he felt that was a bridge too far for the Incredible Hulk. Ironically enough, because on the Incredible Hulk, I mean, in the comic books, I mean, he was going to the other ends of the galaxy occasionally and visiting Asgard and all that kind of stuff. But I think that for the Hulk, which again is the $6 Million Man was not a show that Kenny Johnson started. He came in like, I think, the second season. But as the creator, developer, and showrunner of the Hulk, I think that the kind of stuff that he did on $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman was, a bit too much for his vision of the Hulk. Sure. They didn't really get into the more science fictional elements that were sort of at their fingertips. If you buy into the premise that a creature like the Hulk exists, there are certain things that you can sort of like, certain stories you can kind of do that extrapolate on that concept. They really didn't start doing that until like the fourth season. And when I spoke to Kenny Johnson, he doesn't even think that they did that even in the episodes where I feel that they did.
Sure.
Episodes like Prometheus and the first, he didn't feel that those were episodes that were more science fiction oriented than anything that they had done before.
That's fascinating to me. I mean, what, and for people who don't know, so Prometheus was a two-parter where Banner encounters a meteor that leaves him kind of suspended between being Banner and the Hulk, and that's a very comic book conceit.
Yeah.
And then the first, of course, is for many people, the most memorable episode, which is where the Hulk encounters another Hulk-like creature. And we get the very first time ever where the Hulk faces a supervillain, essentially, in the series.
Exactly. In my conversation with Kenny, and he said I can call him Kenny, so I don't feel weird calling him Kenny. In my conversation with him, he said that, well, look, meteors fall to Earth all the time, so that's not science fictional. And he said that there has to be some kind of government operation, some kind of government plan in the event that if we are ever invaded if we are ever invaded by beings from another world, we have to have some kind of plan in place. So he just felt like it was an extrapolation of things that could exist in real life. So he didn't see it as science fiction. For me, it was the closest we ever came to the Hulk versus the military,
Right.
They capture him. They think he's an extraterrestrial. And again, Kenny Johnson's rationale for all that, and he wrote and directed Prometheus. His rationale was, you've got this government agency that's focused on studying the stars. A meteor is coming to Earth, and then they see this green creature running around at the same time. What's the most obvious? What's the most logical assumption they're going to come up with, which is that
Sure.
this is an extraterrestrial. So for him, he didn't see it as being more science fiction. With the first, which was to some extent more of an homage to the old Universal Frankenstein movies,
Right.
than say The Abomination. He saw it. He in fact, he said to me, he said that was a bit of a stretch, but I could sort of like let it go, and he said, if you've got this world where a David Banner can become this Hulk creature, what's to say that it couldn't have happened to somebody else? So that's the way he saw it. But hey, it resulted in 2 fantastic episodes. So however he needed to rationalize it to make it work, I'm all for it.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. I mean, certainly when I think about the episodes that I feel like popping on, I mean, those are certainly in the mix. I mean, I think we're sort of coming at this from the perspective of comic book fans, and it's interesting for me because I was born after the show started, so I grew up with it, and it was, if not my first exposure to the Hulk, certainly one of my first. So a lot of the stuff that when the show premiered that you looked at and you were kind of like, well, where's Bruce Banner and where's I just took for granted. I was like, well, this is just how it is. The show does this and the comics do this. Like, it never occurred to me that the twain should meet,
And even that, I mean, the Hulk magazine, I was buying that like going out of style. The first 9 issues were very much in the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby mold. And then because the TV show was premiering, they changed the whole format and basically directed, Doug Mensch, who was the writer, to start doing, stories that, reflected the approach of the TV show. Right. And Doug, to his credit, because I agreed with him, I was around 8 or 9 years old, and I would be, getting issues of the Hulk magazine and wondering, why is the Hulk facing such mundane challenges? And Doug's attitude was, this is a magazine. This is a comic book magazine. We have no budget, to have to be concerned about. We can have this character do whatever he wants, and he's one of the strongest beings on Earth. Why are we limiting ourselves? And I would write in, and not one of my letters ever got published, but I would write in, issue after issue saying, when is he going to fight something that really challenges him?
Right.
And eventually, Doug left the book because he and editor-in-chief Jim Shooter were at loggerheads. Doug, to his credit, Doug was trying to tackle themes and concepts that the TV show addressed, but he was also trying to keep in mind the fact that we don't have to be limited by the fact that we can't show Lou Ferrigno lifting an island.
Sure.
We can't do that on a TV budget, but we can do it in a comic book. And apparently he just kept getting hammered and hammered. It's got to be more like the TV show. It's got to be more like the TV show. And finally, he left. And if you look at the issues after he did leave, these were very, very boring stories for the most part. And again, I would write in saying, why are you trying to, do the TV show in a comic book? I mean, it should be, its own thing.
Right.
But, and the magazine ended up getting canceled shortly after that anyway. So, maybe I was onto something.
Right. Well, and worth pointing out for our listeners who maybe aren't aware, Glenn is referring to the black and white newsstand magazine that, as opposed to the monthly, the comic book, the Incredible Hulk comic, because the comic book, of course, although the comic book adapted to the show as well.
To a certain extent, in the sense that Banner did become more of a wanderer.
Yeah.
But, you still had General Ross. You still had Betty. You still had Doc Samson. He was fighting the Silver Surfer. Only in the sense that yet he didn't have, like, say, New Mexico as his regular place to wear his hat. It took on that TV show kind of approach. And I will say that when the Hulk would guest star in other Marvel books, they absolutely were trying to do the TV show.
Interesting.
If he would show up in an issue of Iron Man or a Marvel team up, they would say, Bruce Banner is hunted, and he would be using a pseudonym. He never used pseudonyms until the TV show came along. So
Well, and this was at a time when Marvel very proudly, any book that the Hulk appeared in, they would put Marvel's TV sensation on the cover. So I mean, the Hulk was a pretty big deal in the sense that certainly since the Marvel age began in the early '60s, it was as big a mainstream success as they had ever had.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. I mean, I can't think of anything else. I mean, the only other things I can think of that remotely approached, the sort of mainstream attention that the Hulk got were those, really limited animation '60s cartoons, with those memorable theme songs,
right?
And the Spider-Man animated series. But other than that, I mean, the Hulk, I would say that the Hulk started to gain some kind of prominence amongst, the mainstream audiences and certainly the counterculture. When Rolling Stone did a feature on Marvel, it was the Hulk that they put on the cover, not Spider-Man, which I thought was really interesting.
Wow.
We're talking like 1971, maybe 72, and I think it was a Herb Trimpe, John Severin illustration. So yeah, I mean, the Hulk was certainly by the time the TV show came along, he was it. I mean,
so he was a known commodity in the mainstream by then.
Oh, absolutely. Spider-Man more so, but the Spider-Man show tanked.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
See, I had no idea. I assumed that it wedged itself in people's collective imagination forever and always.
Are we talking about the one with Nicholas Hammond?
Oh no, sorry. I thought you were talking about the animated series.
No.
The show completely tanked. Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
No,
See, I've forgotten about it in the course of this conversation. Yes, you're
right.
Absolutely
Yeah. I mean, think about it. At the time.
No, but the Spider-Man show came after the Hulk show, right?
Right. But it came on at the time. I mean, when Spider-Man premiered and was on the air, it was on the air at the same time that the Hulk was still in the midst of its run.
Okay.
So at one time, you had both Spider-Man and the Hulk on TV at the same time, and Spider-Man, who was basically Marvel's trademark, tanked, embarrassingly,
Hmm.
and the Hulk just kept on going for 2 or 3 more years.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, I would argue that the reason that the Hulk TV show did so well, and conversely, why the black and white magazine ended up not doing as well, was because the TV show had the secret ingredient that the comic book did not, which is Bill Bixby.
Right. Yeah. I
You
mean,
know,
Bill Bixby was, Bill Bixby was the epitome of, he was the guy that I think a lot of guys wanted to be, and the guy that a lot of women wanted to be with, you know. Women loved him, and he loved women too. I mean, Bill Bixby was a notorious ladies' man in real life.
is that
And
right? Wow.
yeah. And but as Banner, he had this vulnerability, and he was this sensitive guy. Remember, this was the 70s. Sensitive guys were in, you know.
Right.
The Robert Redfords and the John Waynes and the Robert Mitchums were sort of falling by the wayside. And the 70s was a time where Ryan O'Neal would cry over Ali McGraw, and Dustin Hoffman. Dustin Hoffman and Al Pacino were like the big leading men of the time.
Right.
Either of them could have played Bruce Banner too.
Sure. Absolutely. Oh yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
It was Bill Bixby was as much of a that not so much a secret weapon, but he was like a major weapon that show had in its arsenal. He was fantastic.
Well, and when you think about it, I mean, to what you're talking about, the pilot episode establishes that the Hulk is born out of ultimately what his loss and regret and his love for his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that, as you say, that most people can relate to. I mean, completely separate from the comic books, you have to look at the premise that they crafted for the show, and it really works.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's like we missed out on that. I always say this, like, this is my one regret about all the different Hulk adaptations. We've never gotten a realization of that iconic shot of the bomb, the gamma bomb exploding in the background, and Banner sort of being, in the front of it. Kind of that iconic image that Jack Kirby drew. We've never gotten that. That being said, what say again?
I was going to say, we haven't gotten that, and we haven't gotten the act of heroism. I mean,
Right.
that's something that I think certainly when I was working as an editor at Marvel, and I would talk to other people who were Hulk fans on staff, that the Hulk was born as much out of an act of heroism as he was out of an act of man's hubris to try to harness the forces of forces that he cannot control. That Banner, it was quite probably the first act of heroism in Bruce Banner's life, and it cost him his normal existence, and so that's a factor that's missing as well. But the fact that the TV show did so well, and the movie version that we've got now, has ultimately become very, very popular. Shows that act of heroism aspect isn't essential, but it's nice.
Sure. Well, and okay, so let's talk about that. I mean, the fact that this series lasted as long as it did. I mean, what do you attribute that to?
I would say, number one, it did not. It took the material seriously. It did not demean or make fun of itself. I would say that the writing, even on the weak episodes, and there were plenty of weak episodes, but even on those, Bill Bixby's performance, always overcame any sort of weakness in the writing. People just liked him. He was a likable guy, and Banner was a likable character. I think there was also, there was a sense that you could watch it vicariously, in the sense that, you'd be rooting for him, and if something got in his way or frustrated him or stymied him in any sort of way, you got that visceral thrill watching him turn into the Hulk and having the Hulk basically solve the problem. You'd get a rush out of it. So there was sort of like that living vicariously through him. I think that it was and when the show was done well, it was really, really, really fun to watch. It was, I would say there were about 25 episodes that really shine and continue to shine to this day. And they run the gamut from, humorous to very dramatic to very tragic to, the science fiction-y ones that we talked about earlier. There was a lot of variety with the format. They could do, an homage to The Magician, Bill Bixby's previous show before he did the Hulk. They could do an homage to My Favorite Martian and have him team up with Ray Walston, his co-star in My Favorite Martian. Right. Team him up with the kid that starred with him on The Courtship of Eddie's Father. It was as formulaic as it was. There was a sense of variety in the kind of subject matter, and I think that was one of the secrets to its longevity.
Well, and picking up on what you're talking about, I can't help but think about The Fugitive, despite the fact that Ken Johnson might not want us to make that connection. But, I see a lot of similarities between Bill Bixby and David Jansen. Mm-hmm. Because I think both of them had exactly that. They were manly but sensitive, and I think both the characters, again, whether by design or by accident, were constructed in very, very similar ways.
Oh, absolutely. And the show, and so the show is the show, Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, you couldn't not make the connection between that and The Fugitive. I mean, just to the point where Banner would show up in a town and automatically trouble, find himself, basically. He'd walk past a house and get involved in a murder. How many times does that happen? But,
it's funny because I watched, a couple of years ago when the Incredible Hulk, when the movie came out in 2008, and they had like a marathon on Sci-Fi, and you realize when you watch a bunch of these in sequence, at some point it's like, David Banner, just mind your own business.
Mind your own business.
Just keep walking.
Absolutely, yeah. And the show, and sometimes the show sort of became too aware of its own sort of rules, and I think it did get in the way of the storytelling. I mean, they did an episode. This was late. This was pretty late in the game, and they did an episode where Banner befriends a baseball phenom, and this broken down alcoholic sports writer that Banner befriends. He basically convinces Banner to ghostwrite articles for him about this, up and coming baseball player that Banner is also friends with. And Banner stays up all night, basically writing articles for this sports writer in the sports writer's name. And the next day, the sports writer is so appreciative that he wants to pay Banner for the work that Banner did. Banner did the work.
Sure.
Banner says, no, I can't accept. I'm like, what? It's like, I understand you're like you're like Job. You're like this long-suffering guy, and there's always a cloud hanging over your head, and you're sort of like put on this earth to suffer. But you did the work. He wants to pay you for work that you did, and it's cash. You don't have to, you don't have to pay taxes on this. Why are you refusing? And the episode never addresses why he wouldn't take the money. It's like, when did he become a martyr? You know what I mean?
Right.
And that to me was like an example of the, when the show was at its worst, when it became sort of like, no, he's going to suffer just because we've decided that he needs to suffer, and he's going to make himself suffer. It didn't make any sense to me. He did the work. So. I don't know.
Well, and one thing that even as a kid I always wondered about was, obviously you have to have the pursuing figure, and we have if you're talking about Les Mis, you have Javert. If you're talking about the fugitive, you have Gerard.
Yeah.
Here it was a reporter, and it was Jack McGee who's trying to get the story. And I always felt like in a dramatic sense that's far less compelling to me that he's on the run from a reporter than General Thunderbolt Ross, or like some kind of encroaching authoritarian figure.
Right. I would imagine, we didn't talk about this, Kenny Johnson and I, but I would imagine that he stayed away from a law enforcement guy. Well, for two reasons. One is because a law enforcement guy, it might be too much of a stretch for a law enforcement guy to believe that a big green monster is running around. And again, this is supposed to be rooted in reality. I think that's one. I think number two, he wanted to stay as far away from the comics as possible. So that meant no military guys, and I guess that would extend to no cops also. The other thing was, you also have to remember at the time, Bigfoot was a really big deal, which is why he was on the $6 Million Man. And every other week, the National Enquirer, the Weekly World News would, put on the front page, Bigfoot discovered or Bigfoot sighted. And so I think, and at the time, the National Enquirer was the biggest circulation newspaper in the country. I mean, this was around the time that they were so high profile. This was, they on their front page, they ran the photos of Elvis Presley in his coffin. Mm-hmm. And got a lot of, negative publicity for that. They just, people thought that was really tasteless. Yeah. So I think that it was the zeitgeist of the time. And I think that, Kenny Johnson kind of figured, a reporter for a sleazy newspaper that runs stories about Bigfoot, this guy would buy into the concept of a green monster, running around the country.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think they make reference to Bigfoot in the original TV movie. Because Mr. McGee, I think your newspaper is more concerned about UFOs than Bigfoot.
Yeah.
So I think this is only speculation on my part, but I think that was where he was going.
Well, and I will say, I mean, Jack Colvin really made that character intriguing, and over the course of the series, because in the pilot he's kind of a cartoon character a little bit.
Yeah.
But by the end of the run, I mean, he's, we have a real sense of who he is, what drives him. I think they gave him a lot to work with.
They absolutely did. And he did a really good job at taking what started out, as you said, was a real one-note character and drawing out a lot of layers to him, where you get a sense of what his life is like outside of his search for the Hulk. One of the things that I loved about Prometheus was, yes, that, he comes into the story on the trail of the Hulk, but when he discovers this whole Operation Prometheus, this secret government military operation, he's enough of a good reporter that he's like, you know what, I'm going to investigate this. He's not so single-minded and so, one-dimensional that, he sticks to the Hulk thing despite everything else. He is a reporter, first and foremost, and he's able and willing to sort of put his life's work on hold to investigate this other story, and it naturally keeps him in the story because everything is all connected. I thought that was a great use of his character. Yeah. And I thought that he brought, eventually, he was able to bring a certain degree of humanity and I would never say he was likable, but certainly more relatable. And he did a really good job. And it's a shame that his storyline was never resolved.
Yeah, and I mean they brought him back for the first of the TV movies after the post-series TV movies, but it's almost like they didn't know what to do with him there either.
Right. It seemed that the whole purpose, the whole sort of goal with that first TV movie was restore the status quo at all costs, and do nothing more than that. I thought it was a waste. I thought it was a waste of his character. I'm sure he thought it was a waste of his character, but it was a paycheck, so of course he was going to do it. I think it was criminal And I, don't get me wrong. I actually spoke to the guy who wrote the last two TV movies, Gerald Ipigo, but I thought it was criminal that when you're going to do, what's purported to be the death of the Incredible Hulk, and you don't have Jack McGee there.
Sure. To put the pin on his story.
Exactly.
Well, let's talk about those movies in just a second. But before we do that, I want to make sure we also talk about Lou Ferrigno. Lou Ferrigno was the second choice to play the Hulk because they had originally cast Richard Kiel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's so fascinating because, and I think if I'm not mistaken, there's one shot of Richard Kiel as the Hulk, which remains in the pilot.
Yes.
I think it's an overhead shot with the girl, right?
You're absolutely right. It's the overhead shot where he's standing by the tree, and he's gonna knock the tree down to try to save the girl.
So my question is, how is it that Lou Ferrigno is the second choice? How does that happen?
I think. I mean, again, I didn't get into it with. I didn't get into that particular topic with Kenny, but. Again, speculation would be that they wanted somebody really tall.
Sure.
And if nothing else, Richard Kiel is really, really tall. But he didn't have mass. And the way Kenny Johnson has described it in interviews, and I think also on the DVD commentaries, was that he brought his kid to the set, and his son saw Richard Kiel in the makeup and said, "That guy doesn't look like the Hulk." And they realized they had a problem. I think
and folks, by the way, real quick, if for those of you who are having trouble placing a face for Richard Kiel, he was Jaws in The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, the two James Bond movies. That's who they had originally cast as the Hulk.
And I would love to see him in the makeup because facially they wouldn't have had to do much with makeup to make him look Hulk-like. I mean, the guy had that really sort of pronounced brow and the deep set eyes and stuff like that. He kind of had a brutal look to his face. But I think that he definitely Kenny Johnson definitely wanted somebody who was really, really tall. I know that Arnold Schwarzenegger had been considered at one point, but he didn't have height. He wasn't tall enough. So
well, and they clearly found the right guy because I think that when we look at the effectiveness of the show, I mean, I think notwithstanding what you were saying, which I agree with about the makeup in those initial movies being somewhat more Neanderthal than they later refined it to be, but I mean the Hulk is never scary in the show for the good guys. You know what I mean? Like The process, I remember as a kid, the process of the transformation always creeped me out. I remember running into the other room.
Yeah.
But I was never scared by the Hulk. And part of that was the way Ferrigno played it. I mean, he made him like a big child.
Right. Which was kind of the way he was being portrayed in the comics, oddly enough. He was very childlike in the comics, especially when Len Wein was writing him. I mean, Lou Ferrigno, who was, a very limited actor when he first started the series, he definitely, you see his development as the show goes on, and he does add more and more layers to this character who doesn't talk, who's only on screen for maybe 2 or 3 minutes at a time. But he was able to bring a lot to that character, and he only got better as time went on. I think by the end, everybody was sort of going through the motions, but he always brought his A game, no matter what he was given to do.
Well, and so I mean, you mentioned about sort of going through the motions at the end. The Hulk had a run of 82 episodes, which is I mean, it's not insubstantial, but it's also not sort of the 100 plus that we would expect for a successful TV show, what we think of as a successful TV show. So what happened at the end? Did it just kind of fizzle out? Did people just lost interest?
No, I mean, ratings-wise, it was doing as well as it always had. I think it was still in the top 20 or top 30. They were shocked. I mean, the entire production crew was shocked and stunned when the cancellation order came down. Part of it was political, and part of it was ego. My understanding was this was around 1982, and there was a sort of backlash. Oh, TV is becoming too violent. TV is becoming too. It's adding to the violence in the world and all that. And all the networks were coming under fire for sort of going a little bit more daring in their television shows. And so in response, CBS said, we're canceling a slew of shows, and the Hulk was one of them. If you talk to Kenny Johnson, his version of the story is that CBS hired a new head of programming, a guy, I believe his name was Harvey Shepard. And Harvey Shepard wanted to make his mark and basically, remake CBS in his own image. And one of the things that he wanted to do was cancel the Hulk, and he brought in Kenny Johnson to tell him. And Kenny Johnson, made a case for, look, this show is still doing well. I'll tell you what, let's introduce a female version of the Hulk. We've established that Banner has a sister, and let's establish that she has come down with a congenital blood disease, and the only thing that can save her is a blood transfusion from a blood relative. And so Banner would give her a blood transfusion, and you do the math.
Sure.
And so, he said, you give me this, I will give you a female character that is going to blow everybody's minds, and you will get ratings like we haven't seen, And this guy Shepard said, no, thanks, not interested. And I've also heard that that Kenny Johnson said something along the lines of, well, look, at least give us a chance to wrap things up. And he said, no, you're done. You're done. Wow. And what basically happened was the show was canceled. And right after the cancellation order, Harvey Shepard was fired from CBS, but it was too late to bring back the show. So
that's insane to me, because you'd think at the very least, given the success that the show had given to the network, that they'd say, yeah, you know what, here's, you've got 13 episodes left, or, you've got, this is going to be your last season. And right. That seems like the courteous thing to do. And I realize as I'm saying that we are talking about the entertainment industry, where courtesy is not a requirement.
Right. You're absolutely right. I mean, they were stunned. And I think, Bill Bixby was really pissed off, and Kenny Johnson was certainly, he didn't see it coming, because, like I said, the ratings were still very respectable. It was, they had survived so many attempts to tamper with the show, to tamper with the budget. At one point, they wanted Banner to acquire a sidekick, and they would drive around in a Winnebago, and the Hulk would only show up once per episode instead of twice, and the network tried to do. It wasn't even was it the network? No, it wasn't the network. It was it might have been Universal. I'm not even sure. I'd have to recheck my notes. But basically, they weathered so many storms and so many attempts to tamper with the formula, and ultimately it came down to this head of CBS who just was like, no, I'm not interested. This show has run its course. Was wow. I think the way Kenny Johnson explained it to me, and it's just the timing was off. If he had been removed from his position, just a little bit sooner, we might have gotten at least another 13 episodes, or we would have gotten a wrap up. The other thing that Kenny Johnson mentioned was that at the time, aside from say The Fugitive, final episodes were not really part of the landscape, because it hurts syndication. Right. As long as the shows, don't have like a clear resolution or a clear wrap up, they can be run in any order. They can be run at any time. If you do a final episode, well, that's it. There's only one way that you can, there's only one place that you can put it, which is at the very end. And so there right. wasn't a lot of, there wasn't a mandate to do a final episode, but he said to me that had he had the time and the knowledge of what was going to happen, he would have prepared an episode that at least brought some sort of resolution, some sort of at least emotional closure to the storyline.
Right. Well, and so I mean, the show ended, and the property was brought back 6 years later. Kenneth Johnson was not involved, and I mean, what was the rationale behind doing those TV movies?
Well, Marvel was bought by New World Pictures, and
Right.
New World Pictures was looking to make its mark in television, and they had all these, TV properties now, or excuse me, comic book properties that they would try to exploit. And my understanding was the first thing they wanted to do was try to launch at least two new characters, one being Thor, the other being Daredevil. And the idea was, why don't we spin them out of, well, we'll bring back the Hulk, because everybody knows and loves the Hulk. There was still a demand that the show was still in syndication all the time. I mean, it was on, I remember here in New York, it was on every Saturday morning at 10:30 in the morning, and I was in college. I would, wake up early on a Saturday morning, after being out all night Friday night, and I would wake up and watch the Hulk, But the rationale was, let's take this established property and use it as a way to spin off, these additional properties that we really want to do. Use the Hulk basically as a source of backdoor pilots. And I guess that New World approached Bill Bixby, and or maybe Bill Bixby approached New World. I'm not sure, but I do know that one party approached the other, and the idea was, we'll do this Hulk meets Thor, and the idea would be, if it does well enough, we'll launch Thor into his own series. And Kenny Johnson was never asked to be involved.
Oh, interesting.
Whether he was going to be, whether he would have been involved if he had been asked is a whole other issue. But he was never asked. Bill Bixby produced it. Bill Bixby put that project together. In fact, if you talk to some people, they will say that Bill Bixby really was the director, even though Nicholas Correa is credited as having directed it. But if at the very least, Bill Bixby was supposedly the co-director. So this was his property. And Kenny Johnson speculated that, he saw Bill Bixby saw this as, a way to to give himself a chance to sort of run the show,
Gotcha.
Kenny Johnson had run, the original series from start to finish. And I think, and Kenny speculated that, Bill wanted to be in charge this time. He didn't want to have to, answer to anybody, and he had the clout. He had the clout to do it. So that's what happened.
And the first movie did very, very well. It aired in I think it was May of '88, and it was a smash hit.
Yep. Yeah, people were thrilled. I mean, it was like the same with the first Star Trek movie. Is after 7, 8, 9 years, there was a buildup of demand for something new, anything new. That people just for curiosity alone were going to check it out. I think to a certain extent, the show, that movie betrayed the roots of the TV show, and that now you're dealing with the supernatural. And this kind of otherworldly kind of stuff that the TV show never ever would have touched. But it was great to see Bill Bixby back. He looked fantastic. He looked like no time had gone by.
He really does. Yeah.
Yeah, Ferrigno looked fantastic, and even to the extent that Jack McGee was back too. It was fun. It was certainly a fun, well-meaning TV movie, and it did do well. And I took it to mean that when they announced very quickly after that they were going to do another one, and I assumed that they would address what was wrong with this one and fix it in the second one, and I was wrong.
Well, talk about it. Okay, so the first one, by the way, was a backdoor pilot for Thor, which didn't happen, which is kind of interesting because the movie did well. You'd think they would have run with it, but I think they recognized people liked the Hulk, did not like Thor.
Right.
Who was played by Eric Allen Kramer, who went on to be Little John in Robin Hood Men in Tights.
Right, and he was the dad on one of those Nickelodeon shows.
That's right.
I can't remember. My daughter watched it religiously, but he was a guy, and he had good comedic timing. He's a good comic actor.
He's a very funny guy, actually, because he used to be on a show called The Hughleys with D.L. Hughley also, and he was very good on that.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But he was not a great Thor. I mean, I think he would probably be the first one to admit that.
Uh-huh.
But so the Thor series did not happen. However, the movie was successful enough to lead to Trial of the Incredible Hulk, which is the following year, and this was a backdoor pilot for Daredevil. So tell us about that one a little bit.
Okay, well, on this one, I spoke to Gerald DiPiego, who wrote it. And again, yeah, they were trying to. They really wanted to promote Daredevil and try to get a Daredevil series out of it. And if you watch it, you will see that they were pretty faithful to Daredevil and his tropes, in the sense that his main enemy is Wilson Fisk, although they never call him the Kingpin, but that's by and large, who he is. I think they aired too much in the direction of Daredevil, that in the last act of the movie, not only does the Hulk not show up, Banner but neither Banner nor the Hulk play any real important role in the resolution of the storyline. It's basically becomes the Daredevil show for the last half hour, 45 minutes. I think that was a big mistake. I think, I just watched it not too long ago with my daughter, and it's boring. It's a boring movie. It's just not, it doesn't have, even the sort of like campy humor and silliness that the Thor one did. It just kind of drags on. Daredevil's costume is ridiculous. I mean, there's nothing distinctive about it. My understanding is that Stan Lee, when he was visiting the set, said, "Why does Daredevil have no eye holes in his mask?" And the production team said, "Well, he's blind." And Stan's response was, "Yeah, but he doesn't want the world to know that." But it's Hollywood thinking. And I think for anybody who was a longtime fan of the Hulk series, and you always have to keep in mind that every movie is somebody's first, and you can't just cater to the hardcore fans. But I will say that as a longtime fan at the time, and I can only think that I'm speaking for many other longtime fans, if you are calling a movie Trial of the Incredible Hulk, and he does not go to trial, you're ripping off the audience. And I think
when the trial is a dream sequence.
And I think that when people first heard Trial of the Incredible Hulk is going to be the next one, and Matt Murdock is going to be defending him, I think everybody got into their minds the same thing. Oh my God, they capture Banner, and they're putting him on trial for the death of Elena Marks. They're going to tie back into the original movie, and what better way to do that is to have Matt Murdock. Matt Murdock is going to be his defense attorney, so that you have to bring McGee back, and this is going to be it. They're going to explode the whole thing, and it had none of that. And I, as a fan, felt really betrayed.
Well, I mean, why is that? I mean, you talked to the writer. I mean, what was the thought process behind framing it the way they did?
They never gave it a consideration. It never entered consideration because they felt that was too inside. It was too much delving into the archaeology of the series, and it would have put new viewers off. They would have said, well, what is all this stuff that I never saw before? It's too much in the past. It's getting boring. It would have required too much exposition. And there was never under any consideration that he was going to be put on trial for the death of Elena Marks, or I think even B, that he was ever going to go to trial anyway.
Wow. That's baffling to me on so many different levels.
Yeah, I mean, I think that and that's the other thing. I mean, the second one did well in the ratings too. It did do well in the ratings, and I think that's because of the expectations. And sure. I think that Death of the Incredible Hulk, which was a better film, I think that movie paid for the sins of Trial.
Okay. Well, and you know, and before we talk about Death of the Incredible Hulk, worth pointing out, I do think Rex Smith was really good as Matt Murdock.
He was very good. He
You
was
know,
very good.
I would have absolutely watched the Daredevil series starring Rex Smith.
Yeah, I would have checked it out too. They put together a pretty good supporting cast around them. There was a guy who played like his law clerk, or his assistant was really good. Nancy Everhard, who went on to other things, she was his partner. Why they didn't use Karen Page, I don't know, but she was really good. They were likable characters played by good actors. It would have been a decent show. But it like I said, I think that it was a disappointment to a lot of people, and I think that when they heard about the third one, I think people's attitudes was, once bitten, twice shy.
Sure. Well, and okay, so the third movie was Death of the Incredible Hulk, and this is the question. I'm fairly certain this was not meant to be the actual final, really, we mean it, Death of the Incredible Hulk.
Correct.
So what happened?
Two things. One was they were planning a duology, and it was going to be Death of the Incredible Hulk, and then a year later they were going to pick up with I think it was going to be called Revenge of the Incredible Hulk, or Rebirth of the Incredible Hulk. And what was going to happen was, but for all intents and purposes, he was going to be dead at the end of Death. And then you'd find out that in the next one, he was revived. Sure. I can only speculate on how he was going to be revived, but I think there are clues in Death of that would have explained how he would have been revived. Okay. I think some of it would have involved suspended animation, cryogenics.
Okay.
But the one main thing, and this was my understanding years and years ago, and Gerald Dipigo confirmed it. The main reason why it never happened was because the ratings on Death of were so disappointing.
Okay.
They were contracted. NBC and Bill Bixby's production company were contracted, I believe, to do 3 with an option on a 4th. And gotcha. The fourth would have been the Return of. And when they saw the ratings for Death of, they were like, no, we're not going to pick up the option. And, and that was it. It was as simple as that. I think that in the years that followed, I think to give it more of a tragic spin and make it less a matter of numbers and dollar signs, the story became that, Bill Bixby came down with prostate cancer, and that put the whole thing on hold, and then ultimately he passed away, so they didn't do it. The fact of the matter is that Bill Bixby wasn't even diagnosed with cancer when the Return of movie was.
It was a couple of years later.
Yeah, they were supposed to. Yeah, they were supposed to do the Return of the Hulk movie the following year, but Bixby wasn't diagnosed until like 2 or 3 years later.
Yeah.
So that was it. I mean, the third one did not do well, and I attribute at least some of that to the second movie, Trial of. I think people felt burned. It's like, oh, these movies kind of suck. I'm not going to come back for another one. To put it bluntly. But the sad part is that Death of was actually pretty good.
Yeah, I remember I was mostly on board. I think what bothered me was the musical number, essentially, as the Hulk is falling. I think "And Something Ends" is the song, right?
Yes, yeah, and that's Bill Bixby singing it.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's a woman. A woman sings it, and then a male voice comes in on the "And Something Ends," and that's Bill Bixby.
Wow.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I'm going to have to go back and listen to it just for that now.
You're a braver man than I am.
Yeah, and I think it was what's her name? Was the love interest? She was in Highlander, right?
Elizabeth Grayson.
Elizabeth Grayson, that's right. She's God. I haven't seen the movie in 20 years. Well,
it's funny because for all intents and purposes, and I brought this up to Gerald Dipigo, and he said that this wasn't the case, but for all intents and purposes, that's the Black Widow.
Yeah. Yeah,
When you think
absolutely.
about
Yeah.
it. When you think about it, that's the Black Widow. So Banner gets involved with the Black Widow in Death of the Incredible Hulk, and 25 years later, in Age of Ultron, who do they pair up as the romantic interest? I thought it was really interesting. I think it's probably absolutely coincidental,
Sure.
but really interesting.
Well, and I mean that's a good place to look at sort of in a holistic way. The Incredible Hulk TV series, the initial run, the TV movies, that's kind of a closed circle now. What is the legacy of that show? Looking back on it now, this many years later, has it left a permanent mark on the character?
Absolutely. Without question. Number one, it's the first exposure that a lot of people had to the character. I think it left an indelible mark about how the character should be portrayed. The fact that sort of like it's become default to have a Hulk that does not talk. I was thrilled when he spoke in the Incredible Hulk movie with Edward Norton. I was even more thrilled when he said "puny God" in the first Avengers movie. I have to admit, I was disappointed that he said absolutely nothing in Age of Ultron. But I understand that it's because a large part of it is because people remember that TV show. I think that it left an indelible mark in the sense of how the character should be portrayed in live action, at least for a lot of people. I think you can get away with a talking Hulk as long as he doesn't talk too much.
Yeah.
But I think that that more than anything else is the mark that it left. I think that it is what brought the Hulk to mainstream audiences in a way that the comic book never could have or would have. And I think that that more than anything else is its everlasting legacy.
Well, and that's a perfect place to lead this conversation. The Incredible Hulk is a very important show for a lot of people, and the great thing is that it does still hold up. I watch episodes with my kids all the time. It's on Netflix and Hulu and just about everywhere else. And the inherent drama of the characters is something that transcends not only the genre, but it also transcends the time in which the show was made. So it's something that I have a feeling will continue to be appreciated and resonate with audiences for a long time to come.
I agree fully.
Well, and Glenn, again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. This was the hour just flew by. It was such an interesting conversation. I
agree.
And hopefully you will come back and join us when we talk about and other stuff. This is one of those things where sometimes I want to leave it up to our guests to say, hey, what would you like to chat about for an hour? So hopefully you've got some stuff that you'd like to come back for, because I know our guests will appreciate that.
Oh, I'm at your disposal, Zaki. I mean, I can talk for hours about the Hulk, Star Trek, Star Wars, you name it.
Well, I have a feeling we're going to be putting you to use. So
excellent.
Now, Glenn, if people do want to reach out to you, do you have? We mentioned your website, which again is glenngreenbergsgrumblings.blogspot.com. Do you have a Twitter or anything like that people can reach out to you at?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Glenn L. Greenberg, and that's probably the best place to reach me.
Perfect. Well, of course, if you're looking to contact me, I'm also on Twitter at Zacky's Corner. That's ZAKIS Corner. And that's my website, zackyscorner.com. I'm also at the Huffington Post, where my movie reviews go up regularly, as well as a bunch of other places. That wraps up this episode of Nostalgia Theater, but we will be back shortly, and we've got another fun one planned. So big thanks to my guest, Glenn Greenberg, for joining us, and big thanks to you in the audience for listening. We'll see you next time.